Well, welcome everybody to the first series of prostate cancer support groups for this year for 2026. Happy New Year to everybody. Hopefully 25 was a good year for you, and God willing, 26 will be even better. So for the first program of this year, and I think we have a good set of topics lined up for this year, so I encourage you to try to attend all of the programs, whether in person if you can or online if you can't. But the first topic that we had for this year was something that came up in our discussion of potential topics that we thought people probably wonder about. And in the context of, for example, if you have had prostate cancer, God willing, you're cured and you'll never hear from it again. But some patients may be going through long-term treatment for their prostate cancer, either because they weren't cured or they were diagnosed with late-stage disease and it's not curable, or they've had a recurrence of cancer. And then there are those who may go a long period of time with their cancer undetectable and in remission, and then, God forbid, the cancer could come back even years after treatment. So oftentimes they're thinking, well, what are the new treatments that could be coming out for prostate cancer that maybe I might need 5 years from now or 10 years from now, if my cancer comes back or if my cancer gets worse and progresses. And so we've had some talks last year or the year before where we had experts coming and filling you in on, well, here's some new treatments that are coming. And so then naturally the question might be, well, where do these treatments come from? How do these treatments get to us, and how do we know what's in the pipeline and how likely or unlikely those treatments are to get to us? So we thought we would spend one session just really talking about the process. Where do these new treatments come from? What is the process that they have to go through before they reach us? How long does it take a treatment from being identified to actually making it to the bedside to the patient who needs it? Just to, again, give you an idea of how these things might become available to you or loved ones who have prostate cancer, or really any cancer. So this is really not prostate cancer specific tonight. This could apply really to any type of cancer or any type of treatment at all, whether it's for heart disease or diabetes or really anything. So we'll talk about first the pharmaceutical side of things, and then we'll talk about the devices. And we can talk about some examples and kind of fill you in and again, answer any questions as we go along. So again, I don't think this will take an hour, probably take less than that, but depending on how many questions there are, just feel free to raise your hand and jump in if you have any questions as you think of them, or we can do them at the end. So let's talk about pharmaceuticals, drugs. Obviously, there are always new drugs coming out. You see commercials on TV, you see them in magazines and newspapers. You hear about new treatments that are in the pipeline that are coming for the treatment of prostate cancer, but again, for any type of condition. And sometimes they're really exciting things that really can change how we treat something. For example, obesity in this country, we know, is a pretty big problem and only getting worse, unfortunately. But the new drugs that have come out, like the Ozempic and all of these drugs for obesity, have really changed the disease and how we treat the disease. And very recently, the latest development in that in that process is that now there's an oral form of the drug that has been approved, FDA approved. All of these prior to that were injectables. So you had to give yourself an injection, at home to lose weight. Well, now there's an oral form of those drugs that's just been FDA approved, which again is going to change, hopefully change the epidemic of obesity in this country and make people healthier. And it's not just for cosmetic reasons. It's because it impacts heart disease and diabetes and all of these chronic conditions. Even something as simple as like back pain and knee pain. When somebody loses weight, all of a sudden their knee pain goes away. So these are the kinds of things that are really exciting when you see these kind of blockbuster drugs that really change the way we treat a disease. But then there are also just incremental improvements in drugs that are coming out all the time. And so there's, constantly this pipeline of new drugs. So where do these things come from? So we'll talk about like the process of where these things come from and then how they eventually filter down to us, for use in patients. So The primary thing that is really the most important thing about any new drug that's in the pipeline that is eventually going to come to us is that it has to be safe. So it doesn't help that something treats diabetes, for example, but then it kills you with side effects. Like that doesn't help anybody. You know, if it's poisonous or toxic, not going to help anybody. So it has to be safe, and of course, it has to be efficacious. So those are really the two major things that the FDA is looking at, and really that the drug companies are shooting for, because they know they can't get through the FDA unless they can prove two things: that their drug is safe and that it works, and it has to work better than the available alternatives. So if there's already an alternative that's available on the market that works as well or better and is safe, then you can't get your drug approved. You can't just say, well, you know, I want to make money on this drug, so hey, can you approve this, FDA? It's not going to work. It has to be safe, and it has to be at least as good as other therapies that are on the market. So the process from the discovery of a drug to finally get down to a patient, to go through the clinical trials, which we're going to talk about in detail. So it has to be identified, it has to be proven safe, it has to go through clinical trials, it has to then go through the FDA process, and then eventually it gets to us as doctors and patients. That process takes about 12 to 15 years. Crazy, right? That it takes that long? Yeah, it really does. Now, it doesn't take that long for all drugs. So if there's a drug that is kind of a copycat, but it's a little bit better, that typically will get through faster. There are certain designations that the FDA may give a drug if it's really special, that there's no treatment for a certain condition right now, and this is the only treatment that can treat this disease. It gets through faster. But just the typical drug, 12 to 15 years. So you can imagine how expensive that process is. It's been estimated that to develop a new molecular entity, what does that mean? A new molecular entity means that this is a novel drug. It's not that we took a drug and we just changed a little side chain on the protein and made it a little bit better. No, finding a new drug, discovering a new drug, that, you know, a new molecule that can be used to treat a certain disease, to get that to market, the financial investment exceeds $1 billion. And on average, it's $2.8 billion. So a lot of money is spent for these drugs to get to us. And we're going to ask the question, well, where does that money come from? And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So this is kind of a graphic that has a lot of information on it, but I really wanted to show how extensive this process is in terms of time and the different phases that a drug has to go through and why it ends up taking 12 to 15 years. So you start with 10,000 to 15,000 compounds that are identified as potential drugs. So a researcher in a lab or a pharmaceutical company, somebody discovers a possible drug that could be used to treat some condition. Well, of the 10 to 15,000 of those, only about 250 of them actually end up being possible treatments for that condition. That these are actually viable treatments. They're safe enough to even consider and potentially efficacious enough to consider to do a human trial. And of those 250 compounds that get to that preclinical phase, only about 5 of them actually end up going into clinical trials. Now, where did all the other ones go? Well, a lot of them ended up going through animal trials and turned out to be too toxic, or they weren't efficacious enough. And so a lot of those dropped out, and a lot of those compounds that were identified as potential treatments, and a lot of money was spent to identify those, a lot of those drop out, and only 5 of them end up actually going into clinical trials. And then to actually go through the clinical trial process, we'll talk about phase 1 trials, phase 2, phase 3. You have to go through all of those clinical trials before you even get to the FDA. And then those 5 compounds that go through the clinical trials, of all of those, one of them actually ends up being an FDA-approved drug. So we started with 10 to 15,000 possible drugs, and we ended up with only 1 drug. And that was a very long and expensive process to get to it. Now, on the plus side, when we get to that 1 drug, the good news is that, yes, it took a long time. It was a very expensive process. But the good news is that that 1 drug that we ended up with, we know for sure is going to be safe and efficacious, because all of those other ones were ruled out to get to that 1 drug. So that's the plus side, is that whatever does end up making it to the market, the process is robust enough that those drugs are the real deal. You know, we can be confident that those drugs do what they're supposed to do and are safe to be used in humans. And again, we'll talk about how the FDA makes sure that that's the case. So these are all the phases that a drug has to go through. And we talked about the first 4 phases to get to FDA review, just to make it to the market. But then even after it makes it to the market, the FDA continues to monitor all of the FDA-approved drugs and devices long-term to make sure that there's no unexpected things that pop up in widespread use. Because the clinical trials, of course, are a smaller number of people. Once you hit the market, you're going to have a much larger number of people using those drugs, and we want to make sure that none of them has something that was unintended. So the discovery and development process, so again, that first step of identifying the possible compounds or chemicals that maybe could be used for a certain disease, those 10 to 15,000 that we started with to get to that one drug. How does that happen? Well, that's typically done by researchers in a lab identifying a target molecule, some protein that might be able to treat a certain specific disease. And again, they're screening through thousands and thousands of these before they find a potential candidate, because some of these will be toxic, some of these will have, some spin-offs that cause problems for humans or even in animals, and some of these won't be molecules that can have the intended effect at the dose that would be safe to take. So in other words, you may find a molecule that maybe helps diabetes, but you'd have to give it in such a high dose to actually make the effect that you want that it would cause 10 other problems. Well, then, of course, you're not going to take that to a clinical trial. So that first step is just identifying the molecule. The preclinical research is where you do the lab tests. So start in the lab, the basic science, the chemistry, the biology, the animal studies, and then you have to get through that before you get to the clinical trial, to the human trials. Once you get to the human trials, again, there's 3 phases: phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Phase 1 is purely safety. So phase 1 is not going to tell you whether the drug actually does what it's supposed to do. It's not intended for that purpose. Phase 1 is purely to determine whether this is a safe drug for human beings to take. And so those trials are usually smaller number of patients, on the order of 20 to maybe 100 patients, where you basically give them the drug and make sure they don't have, any kind of serious side effects. And then the phase 2 is where you're actually looking at whether or not it's effective. So now you're going to be taking patients who have that condition that you're trying to treat, and you're giving them the drug and then seeing, did it actually do what we thought it was going to do? And is it safe in those roughly 100 to 500 patients? And the clinical trial could be 250 patients, 500 patients, 400 patients. The number of patients would be determined by that specific trial and the number of patients needed to see the effect that you're trying to determine. So a drug that's only going to have a 10% effect on the disease you're trying to treat, you're going to need a larger number of patients to show that effect. A drug that you think is going to be much more potent, much more effective, well, then you don't need as many patients to see that effect, so you could do a smaller trial. So that's why these numbers are, again, kind of rough estimates. And then the phase 3 is the really important one, because the phase 3 is the one that the drug company is going to take to the FDA and say, here's the proof that our drug does what it is supposed to do and is safe to use in humans. And if you approve it, it's going to be used in people on the market. So those have to be larger scale trials on the order typically of 1,000 to 5,000 people. And then once it gets through the phase 3, then the drug company then sends it off to the FDA for review and for approval. And again, what I said before is the FDA's role is really to make sure that the drug has the benefits that it's supposed to have, and that those benefits outweigh the risks or the side effects for that intended use. So the FDA is very strict about monitoring these, because if the FDA approves it, it's going to the market and it's going to be prescribed and used by patients. And so the FDA's role, which is the Food and Drug Administration, if you're not familiar with what FDA stands for. So the FDA is the government, the federal agency that's responsible for food and drugs in this country. Food meaning like the stuff at the restaurants, the stuff in the grocery store. They monitor all that for toxins and any kind of impurities, etc. Drug is all of this medical stuff that we're talking about. So that's what the FDA does. And so the FDA is going to do that regulatory approval for anything before it can go to the market. And so they're going to be reviewing all of the data that came from the clinical trials that the drug company did, that they submitted to the FDA before it can be approved. And then again, after the drug is approved, they do post-market safety monitoring and make sure that the drug is safe in the general population, because the trial may have been 5,000 people, but then now the drug is being prescribed to tens of thousands of people. That's when the 1% things may start coming out that you didn't see in the trial. And the FDA specifically has something called the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. So this is a kind of a subset of the FDA, which again is responsible for all food, all drug in this country. And the FDA, by the way, is the most rigorous version of that governmental agency of pretty much any country in the world. So, that's why we have such a safe, food and drug pipeline. And so essentially what they're looking at is they're looking at the condition that the drug is trying to treat, what is currently on the market and currently available, because again, it has to be at least as good or better. And then they're looking at the risks and benefits, so the side effects and complications that the drug may have caused in the clinical trials. And then for those drugs where they feel it's necessary, if there's a drug that has potentially serious side effects or serious potential problems, then they'll create what's called a risk management and mitigation strategy. So now the drug company will have to have this risk management strategy for how they're going to identify and manage those side effects when they happen. So let's say, for example, you have this great drug that really is amazing and really helps to treat heart disease, but in 0.001%, there's this really serious side effect that could be fatal. Well, then how's the drug company going to identify that 0.001%, find those people, make sure they don't take the drug, and then monitor people to make sure that they're not having that complication? That's an example of a situation where the FDA would say, well, yeah, we'll approve your drug, but you have to have this safety monitoring in place because of this really potentially devastating complication. So we talked about how not all drugs take 10 to 15 years, to get approved, and that there is a process by which the FDA fast tracks certain drugs. And the example I put on here is HIV and AIDS, because this process came about in 1992. So for those of you who remember, the AIDS epidemic was really taking off in the early 90s, and we didn't have any treatments for it. So when finally the disease was identified and we actually knew what was going on, because a lot of these patients who were getting HIV and AIDS, at first nobody knew what it was. It was a new disease that we never really knew existed. So when it was finally determined that this is the disease, well, we didn't have any treatments for it. And so we didn't have 12 to 15 years to wait for the AIDS drugs to come on market to treat all of these men and women who were dying of the disease. So at that time in 1992, the FDA developed this fast track process where certain drugs that treat serious conditions, fill an unmet medical need, like again, HIV, AIDS, or Alzheimer's, other diseases where we don't really have a lot of good treatments for it, the FDA can then designate that drug will be a fast track drug and get it through faster. Not that they do it in an unsafe fashion, but just to accelerate the process because of the necessity of how important that drug is and how important that its need is in the market. And then if they designate something as a breakthrough therapy, that's essentially a situation where we don't really have good treatment for a certain condition, or we have a drug that is so dramatically better than every other option that we have for that condition, that would be given the breakthrough therapy designation to, again, fast track it through the system and get it through the FDA faster. Doesn't mean, again, that they're skipping the clinical trials and they just did it in some rats and, okay, now, hey, put it out on the market. No, you can't do that. But at least the FDA process of the approval can go faster so they can get things out. And at least that last step in the process can be done faster. And so that essentially would be given a priority review where essentially the FDA is trying to get that drug and all the clinical trials have been done, the data has been collected. The FDA is trying to get that to the market within 6 months compared to the standard review, which takes longer. Can be 10 months, can be a year, sometimes a year and a half. So who pays for all of this? I'm sure you're wondering. So some people are under the impression that the drug companies pay for all of this. Some people are on the impression that the government pays for all of this. It actually turns out to be a combination of both. So where does the government pay? Well, the government ends up paying for a lot of the early stages. The research phase of almost all of these drugs happens with NIH funding. And so essentially that first process of identifying those 10 to 15,000 potential drugs, and then the basic science and the animal testing to whittle it down to 250 drugs, a lot of that is paid for by NIH funding. So most of that is government funding. So it's our tax dollars to create that initial pipeline before it ever gets to the drug company. And then in the next phase, all of the clinical trials where you're actually doing human testing, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, the vast majority, if not all of that, is done by industry. It's done by the pharmaceutical companies. So the pharmaceutical companies, for example, would license a drug from a university that identified that this drug could be used to treat heart disease or diabetes or whatever. They did the animal testing. They said, yes, we think this could really be used in humans. Now the drug company comes in and says, okay, we're going to license this from you. We're going to do the clinical trials, make sure that it can indeed be used in humans. If it doesn't work or it kills people, obviously it's never going to make it to the market, but that's the risk that the pharmaceutical companies are willing to take to spend the money on the clinical trials. And so, as you can see, there's a collaboration, at least how it's done in this country, between government funding and industry funding, but there's no doubt whatsoever that industry, meaning the pharmaceutical companies, are getting a huge subsidy from our tax dollars because of all the money that's spent up front. If they had to do all of that, it would be much more spending on their part, billions and billions of dollars a year that they would be spending. So indeed, we are subsidizing the pharmaceutical companies to have that government do a lot of that early funding. But the benefit that we derive from it and why it makes sense for us as taxpayers to want to pay that money is that we got the best drugs in the world coming out of the United States as opposed to somewhere else. So it's good for us because we get access to these drugs. They end up being produced by American companies so that the profits that they make later is helping the economy. So there is some, again, give and take, some pros and cons to that partnership between industry and government. So to put this into actual dollars and cents, the NIH, there's a study that was done from 2010 to 2019 to kind of specifically look at how much money is spent by the government versus industry. And what they found was that the NIH had spent about $187 billion in those early phases to identify 354 of the 356 approved drugs during that time. So in the course of 9 years, 356 drugs had been FDA approved to go on the market, and the government had actually spent $187 billion for all but 2 of those drugs. So all but 2 of those drugs, the NIH funded the discovery of those drugs, and the other 2 were discovered by industry without any NIH funding. So that gives you, again, an idea of how much of this is really funded by our taxpayer dollars. So per drug, on average, it was $1.4 billion for each first-in-class drug. First-in-class meaning that there was no other treatment for a certain condition, and it cost $1.4 billion to find that drug that could then make it through. Because again, if it's a copycat drug, it's less expensive to produce that drug and go through the clinical trials and whatnot. But for a new drug, it's $1.4 billion just in the research that NIH spends to find that drug before it even makes it to the clinical trials. But then once those drugs made it to the clinical trials, the industry funding, the NIH funding for those was $8.1 billion, but the other roughly 90% came from industry. So again, the NIH spent $187 billion to find those drugs, get them to clinical trials. At that point, the NIH only spent $8 billion on the actual clinical trials. The industry actually did the other 90%. So if you do the math, that ends up being about $80 billion from industry, $8 billion from the NIH for the clinical trials. So the vast majority of upfront money is spent by the government, and then in the clinical trials to actually get it to market, make sure it's safe through FDA, the vast majority of them, about 90%, is paid by industry. So what about AI? Has anybody heard anything about AI as it relates to this? Because it's really a hot topic. Well, let's talk about it because it's out there, and if you haven't encountered it already, I'm sure you will. So does AI have the industry, have the potential to have an impact on this industry? And the answer is a resounding yes. And it has the potential to do so in multiple ways. So how could AI help us in the process of drug discovery? Well, as we were saying, that first process, the very first step in trying to find a new drug is that you have to find these 10 to 15,000 potential candidates for a drug to get down to that one drug that actually ends up making it to the market. Well, that's where AI can help, because AI can find more of those 10 to 15,000 up front and can help us filter through those to figure out, to drop out a lot of them early on that are just not going to work, and then help us find the one that's actually going to make it through the whole process. That's where AI can help us. So a recent analysis that was published in 2022 found that the pharmaceutical companies are leveraging AI and already have 158 small molecule drugs, so drugs that they went through that process of the 10 to 15,000 to filter down to one. Well, there's already 158 of those ones that are in the process of being tested for possibly becoming clinical drugs, and 15 of them are already in clinical trials. So remember, we said 10 to 15,000 to get through the clinical trials to end up to be the one drug. Well, we've got 158 that are in the preclinical phase that have already been filtered out of the 10 to 15,000. So that would have been 150,000 to start with. And 15 of them are already in clinical trials, which again would have taken each of them 10 to 15,000. So that's 150,000 at least drugs that had to be potentially identified to ever make it to the clinical trial phase. So those are all found by AI that we probably wouldn't have found otherwise. So, or it would have taken us 10 years to find them. So AI is basically helping us find those candidate drugs in that very early process. And it's estimated that the market for this drug discovery through AI has already been estimated at about $1.9 billion as of 2024. And it's expected to make a roughly 30% annual increase to reach $9.1 billion by 2030. So that gives you an idea of how quickly this is growing. As AI is getting better, it's going to have more and more potential to identify those drug candidates early on, and then help us figure out which are the promising candidates to go after and which are the duds that we should leave alone. So as of now, the AI, the companies that are using AI to identify these drugs are about 50% of those candidate drugs that are being discovered right now by big pharma. So, the big pharmaceutical companies that are constantly looking for that next blockbuster drug, about half of those candidates are coming out of AI. So what can AI do? Again, it can find those target drugs much earlier, validate whether or not they're potential, proteins, potential chemicals that could be used in human patients. So it can find those, those new potential drugs, and then it can help us to figure out which are the ones that we should be investing in, which ones we should leave alone. It can help us predict how efficacious the drug is going to be, how potentially toxic the drug is going to be, what potential side effects the drug is going to be, even before you get to the clinical trial. Because imagine how valuable it would be to know that, yeah, this drug is going to work really well, but the side effects are going to be terrible when you get to clinical trials. It's never going to make it through. Well, then we don't want to spend money as a society testing that drug in patients and human beings, in addition to the harm it might do to those people in the clinical trial. We don't want to waste time on that. AI could help us to know that, hey, stay away from those. It's not worth the investment. And then it also can help us to predict the interaction of those potential drugs with other drugs. So, for example, if we find that, yeah, this is a good candidate drug, but it's only going to have a 10% effect, well, it's not worth us going through the clinical trials. We're not going to make any money on that. Forget it. Oh, but wait a minute. If a patient took that drug and this other drug together, then instead of it only doing 10%, it's going to have a 30% effect. Well, now it's worth it. AI can help us predict that. So again, the predicted market for this is expected to grow 30% a year. So it's growing very rapidly. And not a lot of investments you could make in anything that will grow 30% a year. So that's pretty impressive. And about a quarter of it is being done in cancer. So again, this comes back to us, we're kind of relevant with prostate cancer, that the AI investment in finding new drugs, about a quarter of that is being done for cancer treatment. All right, so that's pharmaceutical, that's drug. Let's spend a little bit of time talking about medical devices, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So what are medical devices? Medical devices are everything other than drugs that are used in the treatment of patients in medicine. So it could be anything like a pacemaker, it could be a surgical robot, it could be a CAT scanner, anything that's used in the treatment or diagnosis of patients other than drugs is a medical device. And there's different ways that a medical device can be approved by the FDA, and we'll talk about that. And a lot of it has to do with how risky those devices are or how new, different those devices are. But essentially, A new device would be identified either something that is an adjustment of a currently available device, so you're trying to make something better, or you have a completely new device where there's nothing like it that's ever been used in medicine. So an example of that would be, well, we have an MRI scanner, and that MRI is currently 1.5T, and so it's able to detect a certain amount of resolution. Well, now we've got a 3T scanner, and then in a few years we've got a 5T scanner, and we're just making the MRI more and more able to diagnose certain diseases. So that's one example. Another example of something completely new where there's nothing like it is the surgical robot. So 20 years ago, we used to do all surgeries by hand and cut people open. And then this robot was developed as a way to do surgery and not have to cut people open. Well, obviously that has to go through very rigorous testing before the FDA would ever approve that, and as would any new device that's similar. So the regulatory pathway, and we'll talk about this because, again, there's different pathways depending on what kind of device it is, either a 510K, a PMA, a de novo, or exempt. Very rare for something to be exempt. But we'll talk about, again, what these situations are. And again, for something that's going to be higher risk, then the company that's trying to, bring this product to market, this medical device to market, would have to do an IDE, would have to basically do a clinical trial where they're going to be collecting data on the use of that medical device in humans, and then submitting that clinical trial data to the FDA for approval. And again, the FDA always looking at safety and effectiveness. So it has to do what it's saying it's supposed to do. It has to be as good or better of something else on the market already or available. And then it has to be safe. So that's what the FDA is evaluating all of these things for. And then when it comes to the authorization for the FDA to say, yes, you can sell this on the market, you can make this available to patients, the FDA would either grant clearance if it's an 510K, which we'll talk about what a 510K is, or they give approval for a PMA. Again, we'll talk about what that is. And then after the fact, just like they were for drugs, after it's approved and now it's being used in wide scale on human patients, the FDA continues to monitor the device's performance and make sure that it's safe to be on the market. So, for example, for me as a physician, if I'm using a certain device in human patients and there's some unintended complication that happens with that device, I can go on the FDA website today and make a report. And then the FDA launches an investigation and they go to the company and they say, hey, look, your device did this and this in this patient. And then they would come and investigate what happened to that patient and make sure that that's not something that additional patients in the future would be at risk at. So what are the device classifications? And again, as I mentioned, everything used in medicine is FDA regulated. Everything. Nothing escapes the FDA, even something like a Band-Aid. Yes, even Band-Aids have to be FDA approved. But those are considered low risk class 1. And so those really end up being just something that have to be registered with the FDA before they can be sold. So they're listed and registered, but they don't have to go through any kind of clinical trial. So Band-Aids doesn't have to go through a clinical trial, which obviously makes sense. Even like things like tongue depressors, blood pressure cuffs, all of these things are at least listed and registered with the FDA, but those would be considered low risk class 1. Class 2 would be moderate risk things like catheters, syringes, hearing aids, something where, again, there could be some kind of complications with it or some kind of side effects with it, but those would go through 510K because there's something that's substantially equivalent to it already on the market. So again, if I said, okay, well, I have an MRI machine that's 1.5T, now I have a better version that's 3T, that would be a 510K. You wouldn't have to do a clinical trial and prove that it's safe because it's just a little bit different than something already available and somewhat better. Same thing with a robot. So you have a robot and you decide, well, we're going to change this little gear or something. It's not going to make a big difference to how it works. Then you would get a 510K. It would be approved. You can start using it on people. And then you'd have the post-market evaluation that the FDA does long-term to make sure that it's safe. So the 510K is not like a blank check, do whatever you want, and then it turns out to be a disaster. It's still going to have the post-market monitoring by the FDA, but essentially it's saying you don't have to do a big clinical trial because it's something relatively minor for something that's moderate risk, not high risk. High risk would be a new device, something like a pacemaker, something like an artificial organ, something like a dialysis machine, something new where you don't have something similar already on the market. And you're saying, hey, I just invented a new type of dialysis, completely different than the current dialysis machines. I have a new type of dialysis. well, that's going to have to go through a clinical trial. And so that's what's called the pre-market approval or the PMA process. So again, a new device would either go through 510K if there's already something on the market that's similar, but if it's a completely new thing, it has to go through PMA or pre-market approval, which requires scientific evidence, clinical trial. So it's going to obviously take a lot longer and be more expensive for the company trying to market that device for our safety. A de novo classification is something that is specific to a novel device with no existing predicate when it can be classified as a 1 or 2. So in other words, not everything new has to go through a clinical trial. So for example, if we have, certain, Band-Aids and I invent a new type of Band-Aid, I don't have to do a clinical trial because that's going to be a class 1 or a class 2. It can still be given de novo status that, hey, this is something new, there's nothing like it, but it doesn't have to go through a clinical trial. So the class 1, again, many of these are exempt. They just have to be registered and listed with the FDA, but they don't have to do a clinical trial. The 510K, again, is the medium risk, but there's some kind of predicate device, something similar to it already being used on the market. The FDA usually tries to make a decision on those within about 90 days. But if they need additional information, then the company has about 180 days to respond, and that could prolong the process depending on how long it takes them to produce that data to the FDA to get approved. And then the higher risk ones, the initial review is only 45 days. But again, these are the devices that are going through clinical trials. So the FDA will take 180 days, but sometimes can be longer if they need more data or if they're not happy with the results of the clinical trial. So what does this mean? I'll give you an example. So for example, in the field that I'm in, new robots for surgery. So last year, the FDA started looking at a robot that was developed by a company called Medtronic to compete with the Intuitive robot. Well, it took them about a year to approve it, even after they finished the clinical trials. So why did it take a year if it's only supposed to take 180 days to do their initial review? Well, it took a year because after they completed the clinical trial, submitted the data to the FDA kept coming back and asking more and more questions. What about this? What about this? Does this really work? Is this really safe? Prove to us that this robot can be on the market here in the United States. So it took about a year. So again, just to give you an idea of how the process works. So in conclusion, the medical innovation process, whether it's new drugs or new devices, it's a very long and complex process. But again, a lot of that is for our safety, is to make sure that anything that eventually makes it to the market in the US is safe and does what it's supposed to do. Research funding is really critical to continue the pipeline because, again, as you saw, a lot of that basic science research is the pipeline that produces those thousands and thousands of possible things that may someday make it to the market. If we didn't have those, we'd never end up with the final product that makes it to us as doctors and patients who need those new drugs and devices. And as I mentioned, AI is likely going to have a dramatic impact on this. AI is going to make that, especially those early stages of identifying those potential candidates, it's going to make that much faster and hopefully help us sift through those potential candidates much more readily. So most likely, we're going to see really a huge uptick in innovation in the medical space because of AI, if it's used to its potential as it appears that it's going to be. So that's all I have for you tonight. I'll stop there and give you a chance to ask questions if anybody has any. Hopefully that was beneficial to you. Again, this is more of kind of a curiosity topic. This isn't something you're going to take home and well, unless you're going to go home and try to figure out what stocks to invest in, maybe it'll be helpful for you for that purpose. But this is really more of a curiosity topic just to help all of us understand where does all of this stuff come from and how does it eventually get to you and get to me as a doctor. Yes, question.
I guess two-part question. Would I be wrong in thinking that for the pharmaceuticals that there'd be at least two different classes, one dealing with, I guess, treatment of a condition, and the other that would be more geared towards chemotherapy for destroying cancer cells?
So they're treated exactly the same way by the FDA.
Oh, okay, that was the second part of the question. So,
yeah, all pharmaceuticals are treated the same way by the FDA. So, to get through the FDA process, they're treated in the same way. They have to be, gone through clinical trials and proven for safety and efficacy, whether it's for cancer or any other condition. Yes.
So these molecules are primarily proteins that you're describing here? Is that the typical type of molecule that?
Typically. So it doesn't have to be, there's exceptions, but the majority of them are proteins because the protein is really the end product of our DNA that is affecting most of the processes that go on in the human body.
So are
So
these synthetic?
DNA then become, the mRNA, the messenger RNA, and then that goes into the cell, and the engine of the cell produces the proteins. The proteins then get released to do whatever effect they're supposed to do. So most of them are ending up proteins. Now, there are some exceptions. So there are some treatments that go through FDA approval. For example, when you talk about altering genes, certain diseases are genetic mutations that don't have a drug target. But if you can fix the defect in the DNA, you can actually end that disease process in that person. So, so those would still be FDA regulated, but they're not really the end product, the protein. You're actually going one step before and altering the DNA so that the patient produces the necessary protein or stops producing the protein that's causing the disease. But that also would have to be FDA regulated and tested in clinical trials before it could be released.
So are these synthetic or are these extractions or?
Could be any of the above. They're typically synthetic. Most drugs are synthetic. But, ultimately, all of these drugs have some natural version that first clued us onto them in medicine. So, for the treatment, like for treatment of diabetes, for example, we have insulin that our bodies produce, and diabetes is a lack of insulin. So we produce artificial insulin to treat diabetes. But then we also have other drugs that can affect the secretion of insulin. So, there's different ways of treating any kind of condition or any kind of disease. But a lot of the, for example, a lot of the chemotherapy drugs that we use, a lot of them have natural versions that were identified first in nature that were then adjusted and improved and, tweaked to make them more and more potent and more, efficacious. So a lot of our drugs come from nature and are basically either synthetic versions of those natural forms or improvements by changing side chains or small portions of those drugs.
So this process that you described, is it similar in other countries or is that unique to the United States?
It's not unique to the United States, no. So there are pharmaceutical companies, of course, around the world. And so, a lot of companies in Europe and elsewhere that, go through this same process. But nobody invests the kind of money that like the United States. So the reason why the vast majority of new drugs and devices come out of the United States is because we by far exceed every other country in terms of investment. And so, some of you may be aware that the current administration, the Trump administration, has really slashed the money that's going into the NIH to fund basic science research. And there's been an uproar from the science community to say, hey, what are you doing? You can't cut all this money. And the skeptic would say, well, you guys are just mad because that's the hand that feeds you. And now because it's not feeding you, you're not going to have the money that you want. But, if you understand why that basic science is so important to get to those final products that we get, then you start to get nervous when you see the government slashing all of that funding. Because you don't see the result of that funding sometimes for 10 years, 15 years later. And sometimes it's indirect. Sometimes you may have spent millions of dollars to identify some interaction of some protein with some chemical, with some gene, and you don't even know what that's going to mean 10 years later. And then 10 years later, somebody else says, oh, I could use that for my problem. And whoever did that research never knew that we would use it to treat this disease, but gosh, we could use that over here. And then it ends up making a huge impact on something else. A lot of drugs that we use today actually were not developed for the purpose, are not used for the purpose that they were developed. They were developed for something completely different. And the target of that drug or that device was something completely different. But then as it went through the process, it was identified that, hey, actually, this could really help for something else. So examples for you as prostate cancer survivors, there's two big examples. The surgical robot that we use to do prostate cancer surgery today that, more than 90% of prostatectomies in this country are done robotically. That robot wasn't developed for prostate cancer. It was developed for heart surgery. Didn't work very well for heart surgery, but it ended up in the hands of Dr. Menon and Henry Ford. And he said, hey, I could use this for prostate cancer. Wasn't FDA approved for that purpose, wasn't developed for that purpose, but that ended up, being the right use for it. And now we have robots doing everything. So that's one big example. The other example is Viagra. Viagra was not developed for erectile dysfunction. It was developed for a condition called pulmonary hypertension. pretty rare disease, not regular hypertension that everybody gets, but pulmonary hypertension, which is pretty darn rare. And they, the Pfizer was developing this drug, sildenafil, to treat pulmonary hypertension. And what they found was that in the clinical trials, the patients that they were giving sildenafil to treat pulmonary hypertension were reporting that they were getting better erections. And they said, well, we didn't really plan for that, but we should really do a clinical trial of that. And it turned out that Viagra helps with erections by, secretion of nitric oxide, which, yes, it does help for pulmonary hypertension. It's still used for that purpose, but it's a very rare condition. But much more common, of course, is erectile dysfunction. So it turned out that Viagra was very good for that purpose, and it became a blockbuster, first of its kind drug. Now we have a bunch of different versions of Viagra. Other drug companies then came out with their versions and tweaked it, made it a little bit better, either works faster, lasts longer, whatever. But that molecule, that sildenafil molecule, that was a first-in-class drug that really made a huge impact on a condition that otherwise had no treatment.
One of your charts, if I remember the numbers right, you talked about with the NIH funding, it was like 187 billion that went towards 350 something approved drugs.
Yeah.
Does that suggest then that there was a lot more funding in research that went towards drugs that didn't get to?
Oh yeah, of course, absolutely.
So yeah,
Absolutely.
All right.
So this is the minority, right? So the number of drugs that actually end up being approved is a drop in the bucket compared to all the ones that were never approved. So a lot of money was spent on drugs that never made it to the market. But of the 356 drugs that got approved by the FDA between 2010 and 2009, 354 of them would not have happened without that NIH funding of $187 billion.
And going back towards that two-part funding model, I was, when you were going through it, I was just thinking about the fact that the government has one motivation, which is to serve the public interest, and the drug companies have another motivation, which is to turn a profit.
Yep.
And I'm guessing that the public funding is strongly geared towards guiding the drug companies towards drugs that would be in the public interest, even if they're
I think I know what you're saying.
Yeah,
And it's not necessarily
and that concerns me too, with the cut in the funding, public funding, if that will change whatever balance that we have.
So if you looked at purely from the public benefit point of view, then you would want to fund every drug that was going to be beneficial to the society, even if you couldn't make money off of it, right? So even if a pharmaceutical company couldn't make money off of something, you as the government would still want to fund the development of that drug because it's good for everybody, for the patients, right? Well, the problem is that that's never going to happen. Because if some company can't make money off of it, it's never going to make it through the clinical trial phase. So it has to be something that eventually somebody can make money off of, because somebody has to spend the billions of dollars to do the clinical trials.
But even so, and if we can get away from the, you can't make any profit. Certainly, there are some drugs that are a lot more profitable for the pharmacy companies that have modest service to the public, and without a little push from the public funding side, wouldn't that shift somewhat away from the public interest to the profitability?
I see what you're saying, and I think there is an argument to be made there to some degree, but the public interest is twofold. You've got the public interest, or what's good for us as a country, having good drugs and devices to treat diseases and have good health. But then you also have the flip side, which is the financial argument, that it's also good for our country to have pharmaceutical companies and device manufacturers that are profitable and make a lot of money and sell their stuff to the rest of the world. Because then there's more tax revenue and their stocks go up and it's good for the stock market. So there's this two kind of public good goals that the government is trying to achieve. It's not purely from the perspective of, hey, we're trying to treat diseases and make everybody healthy. There's also that financial reason.
It's not pure one way or the other.
Yeah, exactly. It's a mix of both. It's a mix of both.
But there is something there, right?
Oh, definitely. And you know, it's hard to strike the ideal balance because again, you don't really know which of these is going to pan out, which of them is going to have the intended effect and which ones are not. Where I think the government maybe could do a better job would be in regulating at that final step when it finally comes to market, you know, regulating how much the pharmaceutical companies can charge for a drug. So there are some drugs that come to market where they charge, for example, $120,000 a year for a certain drug. Well, who's paying for that $120,000? A lot of times it's Medicare. And then the government could easily say, well, wait a minute, didn't I spend $10 billion to develop this drug so that you could charge $120,000? And now I, as Medicare, I got to pay for this $120,000 for the thing that I spend all this money up front to create this drug. Well, I think the government could do a better job of kind of closing that loop, which they don't do at all. They just pay the money. So that's somewhere where I think that could be probably better balance because Medicare is the biggest wallet that pays for drugs in this country. Now, again, these are being marketed around the world, but we do pay more for all of these drugs than every other country. Yeah. So, you know, we are kind of, you know, paying up front and then paying again when the drug comes out. And I think the government could do a better job of, you know, kind of regulating how much Medicare pays for these drugs. And they're starting to do so. I mean, for decades, they did none of that. And Medicare literally paid whatever the drug companies would charge. And now they're finally starting to negotiate some drug prices, which is really a first just within the last couple of years.
So along the lines of funding and cost, we're seeing more and more ads to the general public from drug companies. And I'm just wondering how much of the advertising cost is causing the increase in drug prices.
Yeah, well,
and also,
obviously it's going to, yeah.
And the second part is why wouldn't the pharmaceutical companies find more success in advertising just to specific doctors rather than the general public?
Well, they do both. They spend a lot of money on both. It used to be illegal. It used to be illegal for drug companies to do direct-to-patient marketing, but it's obviously legal now because you see it all the time. But it used to be illegal. I don't remember when that, you know, that prohibition was lifted, but it's sometime within the last 20 years, and so now it's ubiquitous. And they spend ridiculous amounts of money to market their drugs. And you know, you turn on the TV any time of day, you're going to get some psoriasis, you know, commercial. But I wonder all the time, who are all these people out there with psoriasis that I need to have a commercial every hour on the hour for some new psoriasis drug? Well, it's actually not that many. I mean, psoriasis is a relatively rare condition. Well, why are they spending so much money marketing that drug like Skyrizi and all these other ones? Well, it's because they charge so much for those drugs. So in other words, the pharmaceutical companies, the drugs that they're going to put on the commercials on TV and in the newspapers and the magazines, those drugs are always their most expensive drugs. So when they know that each patient who's put on that drug is going to be an extra $100,000 a year for them, which again, for a lot of these biologics is not an unreasonable ballpark. It's $100,000 a year. So if they know that they're going to get $100,000 for every new patient that gets put on this drug, then they don't mind spending all this money on TV commercials to get that one extra psoriasis patient or that one extra eczema patient or that one extra whatever rare condition, because they're making so much money off of it. So again, that's where I think the government could be a little bit better about, you know, curtailing some of the prices that these companies charge. And their argument is always, hey, look, we spent a lot of billions and billions of dollars to find this drug. We got to make our money back. That's why we got to charge so much. That's okay if you want to charge it from the insurance companies, but don't charge Medicare because we paid a lot of money for that drug too.
That really hits the nail on the head when you have a prescription drug here in this country that's $600 to $1,000 a month. You can buy the same thing in Great Britain in a pharmacy for $15 a dose. Yeah. So I mean, where's the balance there?
Yeah, and it's true. And the reason why it's so expensive in this country is because it can be. Because it can be. That's the market. You know, the drug companies are going to price their drugs as high as they can get paid for it. And as long as the insurances will pay for it and Medicare is paying for it, they're going to mark up their drugs and make more here than anywhere else. Now, if you go to a country that has socialized medicine like Britain, like you said, or Germany, you know, these are countries that have socialized medicine. Everything is rationed and, you know, the government pays for everything. They're not going to pay $100,000 a year for a certain drug. They're going to say no. Well, in this country, Medicare, up until a couple of years ago, was not able to say no. They had to pay whatever the price. They were not able to negotiate the price of that drug. They had to pay the price that the pharmaceutical company charged. They were forced to pay that by law. And then recently, again, over the last couple of years, that a prohibition on Medicare negotiating drug prices was removed. The Biden administration started it. Trump administration has promised to put it on steroids, which is a good thing. The potential unintended consequence and the reason why it was illegal before is because you would wonder, you'd say, well, why wouldn't the government be allowed to negotiate drug prices? Well, the reason why is because if the government goes to pharmaceutical company A and says, hey, look, we want to negotiate the price of this drug, and the company says, okay, we're going to charge you $100,000 for this drug. Medicare says, no, we ain't paying $100,000. We're only going to pay $20,000. And the pharmaceuticals come, we're not going to sell it to you for $20,000. You got to pay us at least $80,000. And they can't come to an agreement. Well, then what ends up happening? Medicare patients can't get that drug. So that was the reason why the government said, Medicare, you're just going to have to pay for it. Can't negotiate. To retain the access to all of those treatments to the Medicare beneficiaries. And the Medicare beneficiaries, of course, they want access to that because they say, look, I've been paying my taxes my whole life and paying into Social Security, and now I have Medicare, and I don't want you telling me I can't get this drug because it's too expensive. I paid into the system. And those voters said, hey, we want access. So that's where all the, push and pull is in the system, and why it's so broken is because you have so many competing, priorities that are going on at the same time, and so many different people who are fighting each other for a piece of their pie. So anyway, I hope this was beneficial and gives you a little bit of insight as you kind of look at things that are going on in the newspaper and elsewhere. And, again, as new drugs are coming out and as you're thinking about, the pipeline for the future. But the future is bright. I mean, the future is bright, and hopefully, with AI, the pipeline is going to be wider, faster, cheaper, and hopefully we'll have a lot of, innovations and developments in medicine over the coming years that will just really be astounding. So thanks everybody for coming tonight. Hope this was beneficial, and please try to come to these future sessions because, again, I think we have a lot of good topics for this year.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
My pleasure.